At my mother's 60th birthday party, my stepdad walked across the marble floor of our Hamptons estate and handed me a flimsy paper plate with a single hot dog on it. He looked me dead in the eye and announced to the crowded dining room that the help eats outside. The entire room burst into cruel laughter. My mother simply sipped her champagne and did not say a single word. I did not cry or scream. I just turned to walk away. But before I could reach the archway, the heavy double oak doors swung open. My aunt walked in, pulled down her sunglasses, looked at the laughing room, and asked if nobody had told them yet. Every single person went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Gwendolyn. I am 33 years old, and for 2 decades I was the invisible scapegoat of my family. Growing up, my mother, Catherine, made sure I knew my exact place in the hierarchy. I was the leftover child from her first marriage, a constant reminder of a past she desperately wanted to erase. When she married Richard, a loud and arrogant man who styled himself as a massive real estate mogul, my status in the house dropped from secondary to completely non-existent. They poured all their love, their money, and their attention into my younger half-sister Isabella. The night of my mother's birthday was supposed to be a grand showcase of the family's flawless image and immense wealth. The Hamptons estate was decorated with hundreds of white roses and dripping with imported crystals. A live string quartet played softly in the corner of the grand hall. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of caviar and expensive champagne. I had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that was understated but professional. I did not want to draw attention to myself. I just wanted to make a brief appearance, fulfill my familial obligation, and leave peacefully. I was standing near the edge of the dining room, trying to stay out of the way, when Richard marched over to me. He held that pathetic paper plate out, pushing it directly into my chest. He told me the help eats outside, Gwendolyn, and his voice carried perfectly over the classical music. Isabella was sitting at the center table next to her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre was a charismatic African-American man who ran a tech startup in Silicon Valley. He loved playing the role of the ultimate alpha male, always flashing his custom-tailored suits and a heavy gold watch that caught the light from the chandeliers. When Richard handed me the plate, DeAndre let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. He pointed his champagne flute right at me. He said I should listen to Richard because my cheap suit was ruining the aesthetic of their wealthy gathering. DeAndre joked that my little desk job doing basic accounting clearly was not paying the bills, and maybe I should take the hot dog because it was the best meal I would get all week. Isabella practically choked on her drink, laughing at her husband's joke. She tossed her expensive blonde extensions over her shoulder and chimed in, agreeing completely with him. She told me to take my paper plate and go back to my boring cubicle because they were entertaining actual important guests tonight. I looked at the head of the table. My mother, Catherine, sat there looking perfectly manicured. She locked eyes with me for a fraction of a second. She took a slow sip of her wine and looked away, completely ignoring my humiliation. She did not defend me. She did not even flinch. What none of them knew, what I had kept entirely hidden from my toxic family for the past 5 years, was that the woman holding the paper plate was not a low-level accountant. I was a senior partner at Apex Capital, one of the most ruthless and successful private equity firms in the country. I managed billions of dollars in assets. I had the power to make or break companies with a single signature. And I had been doing a lot of reading about my family's personal finances lately. I stood there in the middle of the dining room, feeling the stares of dozens of wealthy guests burning into my skin. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or throw a tantrum. The years of craving my mother's validation had officially died in my chest, replaced by a cold and incredibly sharp clarity. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my messages, navigated to my executive assistant's name, and typed 3 simple words. Execute the filings. I hit send. The trap was officially set. I dropped the paper plate onto the pristine white tablecloth right in front of DeAndre, smearing cheap mustard across the fine linen. I turned to walk out the front door, fully prepared to let the financial apocalypse rain down on them from afar. But before I could even reach the grand archway of the dining room, the heavy double oak doors burst open with a massive crash. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. Every head turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Aunt Beatrice. She was my late biological father's sister, a woman who had been strictly banned from this property for the last 10 years by my mother and Richard. Beatrice wore a stunning emerald green trench coat and carried an oversized designer tote bag. She looked powerful, unbothered, and dangerous. She strode into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She stopped right next to me, pulled off her dark sunglasses, and surveyed the room full of frozen, staring guests. She looked at Richard, then at Catherine, and finally let a razor-sharp smile spread across her face. "So," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room like shattered glass. Nobody told them yet. The entire dining room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The smug grins on DeAndre and Isabella's faces melted away into pure confusion. Richard's face began to turn a deep, angry shade of purple. The real party was just about to begin. Richard slammed his fist onto the dining table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. The purple flush in his cheeks spread all the way to his hairline. He pointed a trembling finger at my aunt. He demanded to know how Beatrice got past the front gate and ordered her off his property before he had her arrested for trespassing. Beatrice did not even flinch. She leisurely placed her designer tote bag on an empty mahogany chair and smoothed out the lapels of her emerald green trench coat. She told Richard his threats were as hollow as his bank accounts. Before Richard could scream for his guards, DeAndre stepped out from behind the table. He clearly felt the need to assert his dominance in front of the wealthy crowd. DeAndre was a tall, imposing African-American man who commanded attention in boardroom meetings and charity galas. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that clung perfectly to his athletic frame. He adjusted his cuffs, making absolutely sure the dining room chandeliers caught the glint of his diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch. DeAndre let out a patronizing sigh and shook his head. He told Beatrice and me that we were embarrassing ourselves. He warned us that we had exactly 30 seconds to walk out the front door voluntarily. If we refused, he would have his personal executive security team physically remove us. He bragged that his team was waiting in the driveway and they did not handle trespassers gently. He added a snide remark about how my little accounting job would not cover the medical bills if things got rough. Isabella stood safely behind her husband, crossing her arms and smiling. She looked at me with pure pity. She told me to listen to DeAndre because he was a real CEO who dealt with actual threats every single day. She said I was just a bitter spinster taking out my miserable life on a family that had graciously tolerated my presence. I looked at the mustard stain I had left on the pristine white tablecloth. Then I looked up and locked eyes with DeAndre. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I asked DeAndre if his executive security team was aware that their paychecks were going to bounce next week. DeAndre froze. The arrogant smirk on his face twitched. He demanded to know what I was talking about. I stepped closer to him. I dropped the timid, quiet sister act I had played for 2 decades. My voice was sharp, measured, and entirely professional. I told him I found it fascinating how much money he spent on luxury leases and private guards, while his tech startup was actively defaulting on its server hosting fees. Isabella let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She told the room not to listen to me because I was having a mental breakdown. She proudly announced that DeAndre's artificial intelligence company was closing a massive Series B funding round next month. She bragged that they were valued at $50 million. I did not look at Isabella. I kept my eyes locked entirely on DeAndre. I watched the confident posture drain right out of his spine. I asked him if he had actually showed his wife the term sheets, or if he just printed out fake documents to keep her quiet while he drained her mother's credit cards. DeAndre puffed out his chest, stepping into my personal space to intimidate me. He told me to shut my mouth. His voice dropped to a low, threatening growl. He said a low-level bookkeeper had no right to speak his name. I did not back down an inch. I tilted my head and asked him if he was familiar with Apex Capital. DeAndre stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack. Apex Capital was one of the most ruthless and exclusive private equity firms in the country. It was the exact firm holding the financial guillotine over his head. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he tried to figure out how the family scapegoat knew that name. I told him I did not just know about Apex Capital. I told him I was a senior partner there. I told him I was the exact senior partner assigned to review the desperate, pathetic bailout application he submitted at midnight yesterday. The entire dining room inhaled sharply. Isabella grabbed DeAndre's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. She demanded that he tell everyone I was making this up. She yelled at him to put me in my place. DeAndre could not speak. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. I did not give him a chance to recover. I raised my voice so every single high society guest in that room could hear his failures. I recited his exact financials from memory. I told the room that his revolutionary tech company was a hollow shell. I announced that he had exactly $0 in pending Series B funding. I revealed that he was drowning in $8 million of toxic debt he had not paid his lead software developers in 3 months, and he was currently facing 4 separate lawsuits for defrauding his initial investors. Richard stepped forward, looking confused and furious. He demanded to know if this was true. He had personally vouched for DeAndre to several people in this very room. DeAndre finally found his voice. It cracked as he spoke. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted that I was a liar. He screamed that I was a jealous, vindictive liar who hacked into his computer to steal confidential documents. He puffed out his chest again, shouting that he was a titan of industry, and nobody would ever believe a jealous nobody over a Silicon Valley visionary. Right on cue, a sharp, buzzing sound cut through his screaming. It was his phone vibrating frantically in his jacket pocket. DeAndre hesitated. He did not want to answer it. I gestured toward his pocket and politely suggested he take the call. I told him his chief financial officer had been trying to reach him for the last 10 minutes. His hand trembled as he pulled out his phone. The caller ID confirmed my statement. He swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to his ear. He did not even get a chance to say hello. The voice of his panicked CFO was so loud and frantic that it bled through the earpiece, echoing in the quiet dining room. The CFO was hyperventilating. He screamed that a federal bankruptcy judge had just forced them into Chapter 11. He yelled that the company accounts were entirely frozen and the corporate offices were currently being locked down by creditors. Isabella gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure horror. DeAndre dropped the phone. It clattered against the marble floor, the CFO still screaming through the tiny speaker. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He asked me how I could do this to my own family. I smiled warmly. I reminded him that just 10 minutes ago he told me I was not family. I was just the help. And the help simply did her job. I told him I personally stamped his bailout application denied right before I walked into this dining room. Before DeAndre could formulate another lie to feed his panicked wife, a loud, heavy mechanical grinding noise echoed from the circular driveway outside the dining room windows. A bright orange flashing light reflected off the crystal chandeliers. Isabella rushed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked outside. A high-pitched shriek escaped her throat. She beat her fists against the glass. I walked casually over to the window and stood beside my horrified sister. I looked out at the pristine driveway. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was currently hooking up DeAndre's prized matte black Porsche. I looked back at DeAndre, whose entire fake empire had just crumbled into dust in front of his wealthy in-laws. I told him his leased watch was probably going to be the next thing they repossessed, so he better check the time while he still could. Isabella spun away from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her face was completely devoid of color, her perfect makeup now stark against her pale skin. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She did not ask DeAndre if he was okay, or how they were going to survive bankruptcy. Instead, she marched right up to him and began hitting his chest with her fists. She screamed at him, asking how he could do this to her. She shrieked that the neighbors were watching the tow truck drag away their only symbol of wealth. She cried that her entire social image was destroyed and demanded to know how she was supposed to show her face at the country club ever again. DeAndre scrambled to grab her wrists, his eyes darting frantically around the dining room. He hissed at her to keep her voice down, begging her to stop making a scene in front of the wealthy investors. But the damage was already done. The illusion of the golden power couple had shattered into a million unfixable pieces. When Isabella realized DeAndre had no answers, she turned her wrath toward me. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. She told me I was sick in the head. She accused me of planning this entire spectacle just to ruin our mother's birthday party because I was a jealous, pathetic loser who could never stand to see her happy. She crossed her arms and lifted her chin, falling right back onto the lifelong safety net she had always used against me. She proudly declared to the silent room that even if DeAndre lost his company, she was still the golden child of this family. She loudly reminded everyone that she was the sole heir to Richard and Patricia's massive real estate empire. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and said I could play big shot at my investment firm all I wanted. At the end of the day, she would inherit millions of dollars in property while I would get absolutely nothing. I looked at her. I felt a deep, steady calm wash over me. The anger that used to choke me when we were younger was completely gone, replaced by the surgical precision of someone holding all the cards. I asked Isabella if she remembered the summer I turned 16. I reminded her how Patricia and Richard walked into my bedroom, handed me a stack of cardboard boxes, and told me to pack my things. They forced me to move down into the damp, unfinished basement. I slept on a squeaky canvas cot next to a leaking water heater for 2 years. I asked her if she remembered why I was banished to the basement. It was so she could knock down the walls between our rooms and build a custom 200-square-foot walk-in closet for her designer shoes and handbags. I told her I remembered the black mold in that basement perfectly. I told her I remembered how she used to wear her heavy boots and stomp on the floorboards right above my cot every single morning just to wake me up. Isabella smirked, completely unbothered by the memory. She told me I deserved the basement because I was an ungrateful burden. She claimed she deserved the massive closet because she actually belonged in this family and knew how to represent their high society image. I nodded slowly. I told her it was very funny that she brought up those designer shoes and her high society image. I took a step closer and asked her exactly how she managed to afford her recent lavish shopping sprees in Paris and Milan. Isabella puffed out her chest again. She confidently stated that her husband provided for her, unlike me, who had to work for a paycheck. I glanced over at DeAndre. He was sweating so profusely that a drop rolled down his cheek and soaked into his collar. I told Isabella that DeAndre had not possessed a single dime of disposable income in over 2 years. His company had been bleeding cash, and his personal accounts were completely drained, just trying to keep the lights on at his office. I asked her if she genuinely believed nobody would ever notice the massive financial breadcrumbs she left behind in her desperate attempt to look rich. I turned my body, positioning myself so my mother could hear every single word I was about to say. I raised my voice so it carried clearly to the head of the dining table. I revealed that Isabella refused to give up her luxurious tech wife lifestyle when DeAndre's money ran dry. Instead of getting a job or cutting back on expenses, she went online and opened 4 massive high-limit credit lines. Isabella's confident smirk vanished instantly. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound. She finally stammered, demanding that I shut my mouth immediately. I did not stop. I detailed exactly what she did for the entire party to hear. I explained that she knew she could not get approved for those credit cards under her own name because her debt-to-income ratio was a disaster. So she used a very specific, highly rated Social Security number to bypass the banking background checks. I looked directly at the head of the table. I announced that Isabella had used a Social Security number belonging to our mother, Patricia. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. The crystal wine glass slipped from Patricia's manicured fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered, sending dark red wine splattering across her expensive designer shoes. Patricia ignored the broken glass. She frantically dug into her leather handbag with trembling hands. She pulled out her smartphone and immediately opened her banking application, a look of pure dread washing over her face. The dining room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound was the frantic tapping of Patricia's fingers against her phone screen. We all watched as she navigated to her credit report. Patricia's face contorted in absolute raw horror. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore through the Hamptons estate. Her pristine, closely guarded credit score was completely destroyed. She stared at the screen hyperventilating as she realized she was entirely on the hook for a balance of $400,000 in fraudulent credit card debt. The horrific scream that tore from Catherine's throat shattered whatever remained of the high society facade. The entire dining room watched in stunned silence as my mother stared at her phone screen. Her perfectly guarded credit score was decimated, and she was staring at a $400,000 balance she had no way of paying. Isabella took a hesitant step toward her. She opened her mouth to make an excuse, perhaps to blame DeAndre or claim it was a misunderstanding. She did not get the chance. Catherine lunged forward. She raised her hand and slapped Isabella across the face with such force that the sound cracked through the dining room like a whip. Isabella stumbled backward, clutching her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with absolute shock. The golden child had just been struck by her creator. The perfect, untouchable family was suddenly eating each other alive right in front of their wealthy guests. Isabella started screaming hysterically, pointing at DeAndre and blaming him for forcing her to maintain their lifestyle. DeAndre shouted back, calling her a parasite. Catherine was hyperventilating, clawing at her expensive pearl necklace as if it were choking her. Richard finally snapped out of his frozen state. He grabbed Catherine by the shoulders and pulled her back before she could lunge at Isabella again. He wrapped his arms around his wife, then turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward me. He pointed a thick finger in my direction and bellowed that I was destroying his family. He screamed that I came into his home with the sole intention of tearing them apart out of pure spite. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed. I told Richard that I did not force DeAndre to bankrupt his company. I did not force Isabella to commit identity theft. I simply brought the truth into the light. If the truth was enough to destroy their family, then their family was nothing but a fragile illusion. Catherine pushed herself out of Richard's grip. Her elegant composure was entirely gone. Her mascara was smudged and her face was blotchy. She decided to play her favorite card. She burst into theatrical tears and tried to play the ultimate victim. She cried out that she had given me life. She wailed to the room that she had put a roof over my head, fed me, and raised me. She called me a vicious, ungrateful monster who was punishing her own mother on her 60th birthday. She sobbed that she had sacrificed everything to make sure I had a good life. I felt my jaw tighten. The cold, calculated calm inside me turned to pure steel. I took 2 steps toward her, closing the distance. My voice dropped low and sharp, completely silencing her theatrical sobs. I asked her if she really wanted to talk about sacrifices and providing a good life. I brought up my biological father. I reminded her of the college trust fund he had set up specifically for me before he passed away. It was supposed to be my future. It was supposed to guarantee that I would never have to struggle. I told the silent room exactly what Catherine did with that money. I revealed that the moment I turned 18, she drained every single cent from my college fund. She took the money my dead father left for my education and used it to pay for Isabella's extravagant $150,000 destination wedding in Lake Como, Italy. Isabella looked away, suddenly very interested in the marble floor. I kept my eyes locked on Catherine. I told her how I spent my 20s. While Isabella was drinking champagne on yachts and pretending to be a tech mogul's wife. I was working 80-hour weeks. I worked double shifts at a terrible corporate job just to pay off the crushing student loans I had to take out because my own mother stole my future. I told her I earned every single thing I had through blood and exhaustion, while she wore designer clothes paid for with stolen money. Richard stepped in front of Catherine, puffing out his chest to his full height. He tried to physically intimidate me, stepping into my personal space and using his loud, booming voice to assert dominance. He roared that he was a self-made man. He shouted that he built a massive commercial real estate empire from the ground up through his own hard work and brilliant business sense. He swept his arm across the grand dining room and bellowed that he owned this entire Hamptons estate. He claimed he owned all the commercial properties downtown, and he was the undisputed head of this family. He told me I was a bitter, jealous accountant who would never understand what it took to build real wealth. He pointed toward the front doors and ordered me to get off his property immediately. He yelled that he was done looking at me and done tolerating my disrespect. When I did not move fast enough for his liking, Richard snapped his fingers sharply in the air. He signaled for the 2 private security guards who had been standing nervously near the archway. He commanded them to physically grab me and throw me out into the street. The guards hesitated for a second, then began to step forward. Aunt Beatrice let out a low, dark chuckle. The sound was deeply amused and entirely unbothered. She casually adjusted the belt of her emerald green trench coat and walked right past the approaching security guards. She ignored them completely and strolled straight to the head of the grand dining table. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a massive, heavy legal binder. She lifted the binder high into the air and slammed it directly into the center of Catherine's pristine three-tier birthday cake. White frosting and vanilla cake splattered everywhere, coating the table and dotting Richard's expensive suit jacket. Beatrice leaned over the ruined cake. She looked Richard dead in the eye, a wicked smile spreading across her face. She told him that actually he did not own a single brick of this house. The grand dining room descended into absolute chaos. Whispers erupted from every corner of the room like a sudden storm. I could see the bright flash of camera lenses as several high society guests pulled out their smartphones, eagerly recording the spectacular collapse of the supposedly untouchable Montgomery family. Richard stood completely frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. He stared at the thick legal binder sitting right in the middle of the ruined birthday cake. White vanilla frosting slowly dripped down the side of the dark leather cover, pooling onto the expensive mahogany table. With a sudden violent jerk, he reached forward and yanked the binder out of the cake. He tore the cover open, his thick fingers smearing sticky icing across the crisp, watermarked legal documents inside. He demanded to know what kind of sick joke this was. His eyes darted frantically across the complex legal jargon, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. Aunt Beatrice did not raise her voice, but her tone cut through the whispering crowd like a sharpened blade. She told Richard it was absolutely no joke. She explained that my biological father was not just a successful man, but a profoundly observant one. He knew exactly what kind of woman Catherine was long before he passed away. He knew that the second he was gone, she would scramble to find a new man to bankroll her extravagant lifestyle, and she would undoubtedly try to use his hard-earned wealth to do it. So he built a fortress around his legacy. Beatrice pointed a manicured finger at the frosting-covered pages in Richard's shaking hands. She announced that my father placed his entire massive estate into an irrevocable blind trust. That included the deed to this very Hamptons mansion. It included the commercial downtown properties. And most importantly, it included the massive pool of liquid seed capital that Richard conveniently used to launch his supposedly self-made real estate business. Catherine stepped forward, her face completely drained of blood. She shrieked that Beatrice was lying. She claimed she was the legal executor of the estate, and she had full legal authorization to invest those funds however she saw fit. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between my mother and me. I told her I knew exactly how she got that authorization. I laid out the ugly truth for the entire room to hear. When I turned 18, I was naive and still grieving the loss of the only parent who truly loved me. I trusted my mother. But Catherine took advantage of a vulnerable teenager. She forged my signature on a guardianship extension waiver and submitted it to a corrupt judge. She effectively locked me out of my own inheritance, gaining full control over the massive monthly interest payouts generated by the trust. I looked directly at Richard. I told him he was never a brilliant businessman. He was just a parasite feeding off the interest of my dead father's money. Catherine funneled millions in hijacked interest to him so he could play real estate mogul, but she was never legally able to touch the principal assets. The actual foundation of their entire empire still belonged exclusively to the trust. Richard threw the binder back onto the table, sending clumps of cake flying onto the floor. He roared that it did not matter. He claimed he had possessed the properties for 15 years, and possession was 9/10 of the law. He shouted that he and Catherine were legally untouchable. Aunt Beatrice smiled a deeply wicked smile. She slowly shook her head. She told Richard he really should have read the fine print on page 42. Beatrice revealed my father's ultimate safeguard. He knew Catherine might find a legal loophole to temporarily siphon the interest. So he installed a dead man's switch deep within the framework of the trust. It was a termination clause so aggressively ironclad that no corporate lawyer in the state of New York could ever breach it. The clause mandated that the absolute second I turned 33 years old, the trust would automatically execute a hostile takeover of its own assets. It would instantly dissolve Catherine's fraudulent guardianship, lock her out of every associated holding company, and transfer 100% of the assets directly into my sole legal possession. I watched the realization hit my mother like a physical blow. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to grab the edge of the dining table for support to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. I looked at the gold watch on my wrist, then back up at my terrified family. I announced that my 33rd birthday was exactly 3 days ago. The guests gasped collectively. Isabella, who was still clutching her bruised cheek from where Catherine had slapped her, began to sob openly. Her guaranteed inheritance, the millions she had banked her entire future on to survive her husband's bankruptcy, had just vanished into thin air. Richard stared at me. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly against his collar. He let out a loud, maniacal bark of laughter. It was the desperate, unhinged sound of a man trying to convince himself the walls were not rapidly closing in. He pointed a finger directly at my face. He shouted that I was completely delusional. He claimed the papers on the table were nothing but fake, fabricated garbage printed out by two bitter, miserable women trying to extort him. He puffed his chest out again, roaring that he had the most expensive, high-powered corporate defense lawyers in the country on his payroll. He threatened to drag me into litigation for the rest of my natural life. He swore he would bury me in so many legal fees I would be begging to sleep in his unfinished basement again. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just stood there and let him finish his frantic, screaming rant. When he finally ran out of breath, panting heavily in the center of the ruined dining room, I gave him a soft, pitying smile. I asked him if he really thought his high-powered lawyers were going to work for free. Richard narrowed his eyes, demanding to know what nonsense I was spewing now. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady. I asked him a very simple question. I asked why he thought his exclusive unlimited black card was declined when he tried to pay the catering manager an hour ago. Richard stared at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept the reality crashing down around him. He bellowed that I was talking absolute nonsense. He claimed his exclusive black card was only declined because the bank's fraud department flagged it for unusual activity, which happened all the time when a man of his immense wealth threw a lavish event. He sneered at me, adjusting his frosting-stained jacket, and announced to the whispering room that he was going to clear this up right now. He turned his back on me and marched aggressively toward the grand archway where the catering manager was standing. The manager was a stiff, professional man, holding a wireless payment terminal, looking incredibly uncomfortable with the escalating family drama. Richard snatched his leather wallet from his inner pocket. He pulled out a heavy platinum corporate card and slammed it directly onto the digital screen of the terminal. He loudly ordered the manager to run the card for the remaining $50,000 balance and to add a 20% tip just to prove how ridiculous my threats were. The entire dining room watched in suffocating silence. The machine processed the chip. A harsh electronic red beep echoed against the marble walls. The screen flashed the word declined in bright letters. Richard gritted his teeth. He snatched the platinum card back and muttered about corporate spending limits. He frantically dug into his wallet and pulled out a solid gold personal credit card. He shoved it into the machine. The machine processed. Another harsh red beep, declined. Sweat began to pour down Richard's forehead. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He threw the gold card onto the floor and pulled out a standard bank debit card, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert the chip into the reader. Beep declined. The mighty, untouchable real estate mogul was suddenly reduced to swiping pieces of plastic like a broke college student begging for an extension on rent. He cursed at the catering manager, accusing him of having a broken machine. He demanded the manager run the numbers manually, shouting that he was good for the money and his name alone was worth millions. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. I told Richard his name was not worth the plastic printed on those cards. I kept my voice perfectly even and professional, making sure every high society guest in the room could hear the exact mechanics of his ruin. I explained that when the dead man's switch in my father's trust activated on my 33rd birthday, it did not just transfer the deed to the Hamptons estate. It officially transferred total ownership of the parent holding company that controlled every single one of Richard's business ventures. I looked at Catherine, who was leaning heavily against the dining table, gasping for air as her social empire evaporated. I told them both that at exactly 9 o'clock this morning, as the new legal owner of the parent company, I authorized my legal team at Vanguard Capital to initiate a forensic freeze. I shut down every single corporate account, every subsidiary trust, and every personal line of credit tied to my father's original assets. I told Richard he had been living like a king on my father's dime for 2 decades, and the bank had just officially closed. He had absolutely zero access to capital. He was completely broke. The catering manager slowly pulled the payment terminal away from Richard. His professional, polite demeanor vanished instantly. He looked at the declined cards scattered on the marble floor, then looked up at Richard with pure disgust. The manager announced in a loud, clear voice that his luxury catering company did not provide charity services for fraudulent clients. He turned on his heel and snapped his fingers sharply at his waitstaff. He ordered his entire team to stop serving immediately. What happened next was a scene of absolute poetic chaos. The impeccably dressed waiters and waitresses immediately stopped pouring vintage champagne. They set their silver trays down on the side tables and began aggressively clearing the dining room. One of Catherine's wealthiest friends, a prominent socialite covered in diamonds, was just about to take a bite of butter-poached lobster. A waiter stepped right up to her, firmly grabbed the edges of her fine china plate, and physically pulled the lobster right out from under her fork. The socialite let out a loud gasp of pure offense, dropping her silver fork onto the table with a clatter. All around the room, plates of caviar, wagyu beef, and truffle risotto were unceremoniously snatched away from the bewildered guests. The string quartet, realizing they were not getting paid their performance fee, either quickly packed their instruments into their velvet cases and hurried out the back door without saying a single word. Catherine lunged forward, waving her arms frantically. She begged the catering manager to stop his staff. She cried out that this was her 60th birthday party, and she promised she would write him a personal check tomorrow morning. She pleaded with him not to humiliate her in front of her prestigious friends. The catering manager did not even pause. He told Catherine that her personal checks were going to bounce just as high as her husband's credit cards. He ordered his staff to pack the catering vans and leave the property. The high society guests were left sitting at a ruined, half-cleared table, staring at the empty spaces where their extravagant meals used to be. They were deeply offended, incredibly hungry, and suddenly very aware that they were trapped in the middle of a massive financial collapse. The whispers that had filled the room suddenly escalated into loud, panicked conversations. They were not just embarrassed by the lack of food. The reality of my forensic freeze announcement was setting in. These were wealthy, connected people. Many of them did business with Richard. If Richard's corporate accounts were entirely frozen, they realized their own investments might be locked inside the blast radius. The social embarrassment quickly morphed into genuine financial terror. From the middle of the panicked crowd, a tall, imposing man pushed his way to the front. He was a major investor in Richard's commercial real estate fund. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his thick neck bulged as he shoved a chair out of his way and marched directly toward the head of the table. He stopped inches away from Richard. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He did not care about the birthday cake. He did not care about the catering staff leaving. He glared down at my stepdad, his chest heaving with rage, fully prepared to demand answers for the millions of dollars he had blindly trusted to a fraud. The imposing man did not waste time with pleasantries. He slammed his heavy hand onto the mahogany table directly next to the ruined birthday cake. He demanded to know if the $10 million placement he wired to Richard's commercial real estate fund last Tuesday was currently frozen inside the locked accounts. Richard physically recoiled. His confident, booming voice completely abandoned him. He held up his hands in a placating gesture, stuttering and stumbling over his words. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He promised the furious investor it was nothing but a massive misunderstanding. He claimed it was a simple clerical error at the bank and swore on his life that every single cent of the investment was safe and secure in a high-yield escrow account. I did not let him finish spinning his web of lies. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek silver iPad. I had spent the entire morning downloading the fully unredacted financial records from the parent holding company. I tapped the screen, bringing up the master digital ledger, and casually slid the device across the table directly into the investor's hands. I told the man to look at line item 47. I kept my voice loud enough for the surrounding crowd of wealthy guests to hear every single syllable. I explained that Richard had not placed a single dollar into a commercial escrow account in over 5 years. I revealed that my stepdad had been running a localized, highly illegal Ponzi scheme right under their noses. I told the room that Richard took new investor capital, falsely coded it as property development funds, and immediately diverted it into private, unregulated shell accounts to maintain the illusion of his immense wealth. The investor stared at the glowing screen of the iPad. His eyes darted rapidly across the digital columns, absorbing the undeniable proof of his ruined finances. His heavy breathing was the only sound I focused on. I narrated exactly where his $10 million went, to ensure the knife twisted as deeply as possible. I pointed at Catherine, who was now weeping silently into her hands. I announced that $2 million of the investor's money was used to pay off Catherine's secret exorbitant shopping sprees across Europe and her massive personal debts. I turned my attention to Isabella, who was cowering behind a chair. I revealed that another million went to purchasing Isabella's custom sports cars, funding her lavish vacations, and maintaining her entirely fake high society lifestyle. I told them the rest of the capital was frantically funneled into DeAndre's failing artificial intelligence startup in a desperate last-minute attempt to keep the entire fraudulent house of cards from collapsing. Richard tried to lunge for the iPad. He shouted that the documents were forged and that I was illegally accessing private corporate data. Aunt Beatrice smoothly stepped in his way, blocking his path with effortless authority. She reminded him that as the sole legal owner of the parent company, I had every right to audit my own financial subsidiaries. She told Richard he was in no position to give orders anymore. The investor did not say a word. He slowly looked up from the iPad. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over his features, hardening his face into a mask of absolute hatred. He realized that his hard-earned wealth was not building a commercial complex in Manhattan. It had been squandered on designer handbags, luxury cars, and a fake birthday party for a woman who despised her own daughter. The investor picked up his heavy crystal glass filled with expensive bourbon. He did not hesitate. He threw the dark amber liquid directly into Richard's face. The alcohol splashed across Richard's eyes and soaked into his white dress shirt. The powerful real estate mogul let out a pathetic, startled gasp, stumbling backward and wiping burning liquor from his eyes. He looked entirely broken, stripped of all his unearned power and prestige. The sound of the splashing drink was the spark that ignited the entire room. Total panic erupted among the remaining high society guests. These were not people who handled financial loss with grace. They were wealthy, ruthless individuals who suddenly realized their own fortunes were tied to Richard's sinking ship. The dining room descended into absolute madness. Men in expensive tuxedos abandoned their wives to aggressively dial their personal brokers, shouting frantically into their cell phones. Women in designer gowns pushed past each other, desperately trying to get out the front door before the scandal officially broke. They demanded answers from their financial advisors, right there in the grand hall, screaming about frozen assets and missing capital. The pristine, elegant birthday celebration had transformed into a chaotic trading floor during a market crash. Catherine tried to grab the arm of a passing socialite, begging her to stay and listen to reason. The woman violently yanked her arm away, looking at my mother with pure, unadulterated disgust. She told Catherine she was a repulsive fraud and swore she would make sure Catherine was permanently blacklisted from every country club and charity board on the East Coast. The social destruction of Catherine and Richard was absolute. In less than 20 minutes, they had gone from the undisputed king and queen of the Hamptons to total pariahs. They were radioactive, and no one in that room would ever associate with them again. Their entire identity, built on stolen money and false superiority, was incinerated. DeAndre and Isabella were cornered near the archway by two other furious investors who were demanding to know where their money had gone. Isabella was sobbing hysterically, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. DeAndre simply stared at the floor, finally realizing his fake alpha male persona could not save him from the consequences of his actions. The investor who had thrown the drink stood completely still amidst the screaming and running guests. He wiped a stray drop of bourbon from his own hand. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone. He looked Richard dead in the eye, his voice slicing through the noise of the panicking crowd. I told Richard he was calling the Securities and Exchange Commission right now. He promised my stepdad he was going to federal prison. The furious investor pressed the smartphone to his ear. I watched as Richard dropped to his knees right there in the ruined dining room. My stepdad clutched at the investor's pant leg, begging him to hang up, sobbing that he could fix the accounts by morning. The investor kicked Richard's hand away with pure disgust and began speaking directly to the federal authorities. The entire room erupted into a deafening roar of panic. Wealthy socialites were practically trampling each other to reach the front doors. Men who had spent the last hour bragging about their golf handicaps were now shouting profanities, shoving chairs out of their way as they scrambled to call their financial advisors. The air was thick with the smell of spilled bourbon, ruined food, and absolute desperation. But I was not watching Richard anymore. My eyes were scanning the chaotic perimeter of the room. I was looking for the rat who was desperately trying to flee the sinking ship. I spotted him instantly. DeAndre was no longer standing tall and proud. The arrogant, untouchable tech executive persona had completely evaporated. He was hunched over, moving quickly and quietly along the far wall of the dining room. He had his heavy leather briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. His eyes darted nervously toward the large glass patio doors that led out to the back gardens. I was trying to slip out the side exit while the angry mob was entirely focused on destroying Richard and Catherine. I did not rush. I walked smoothly across the marble floor, cutting a direct path through the panicking crowd. I anticipated his exact route. Just as DeAndre reached his hand out to push open the heavy glass door, I stepped directly in front of him. I blocked his only exit. DeAndre jumped back, startled. His chest was heaving. The custom-tailored navy suit that had looked so immaculate an hour ago was now wrinkled, the collar soaked with nervous sweat. He tried to force a confident scowl onto his face, but his eyes were wide with sheer panic. He told me to step aside immediately. He claimed he had an emergency call with his legal team, and he did not have time for my childish games. He took a heavy step forward, trying to physically intimidate me into moving out of his way. I did not budge a single inch. I crossed my arms and looked up at him. I told him his legal team was not going to answer his calls because their retainer checks had just bounced. Before DeAndre could try to shove his way past me, the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed rapidly across the floor. Isabella came running over. Her face was an absolute disaster of ruined makeup and streaking mascara. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting between me and the screaming investors across the room. She lunged forward and grabbed DeAndre by the arm. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into his expensive suit jacket. She begged him to do something. She cried that our parents were going to lose everything and the guests were going to call the police. She pleaded with him to use his tech startup millions to bail Richard out. She frantically told her husband to call his private pilot so they could fly away from this nightmare and go to their vacation home until the scandal blew over. DeAndre tried to aggressively shake Isabella off his arm. He did not look at her with love or concern. He looked at her like she was a heavy anchor dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He hissed at her to let him go. He told her there was no private jet, and there were no millions. He said he had to leave this property right now or his entire life was over. I let out a soft, amused laugh. I told Isabella that her husband was absolutely right about one thing. He really did have to leave right now. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I looked at DeAndre and told him that when Apex Capital audits a company for a massive financial bailout, we do not just look at basic spreadsheets. We run a full forensic analysis on every single corporate communication. We pull all the records. We monitor all the outbound requests. DeAndre stopped fighting his wife. He stared at my phone, his breathing completely stopping in his chest. I tapped the screen, opened an audio file, and turned the volume all the way up. A voice recording began to play loudly from my phone speakers. It was DeAndre's voice recorded just 2 hours ago. He was speaking to his corporate travel concierge. In the recording, DeAndre sounded frantic and breathless. He was giving explicit hurried instructions to authorize the immediate wire transfer of the last $2 million remaining in his startup's emergency payroll fund. I was commanding the concierge to move the stolen cash into an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The audio continued playing. DeAndre demanded that the concierge book a one-way first-class flight to Dubai. He stressed that the flight had to depart at exactly midnight tonight, and under no circumstances could the purchase be traced back to his personal credit cards. I tapped the screen again, pausing the audio. Isabella stood frozen. Her hands slowly slipped off DeAndre's jacket. She stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. She asked him if he was really planning to flee the country tonight. Then a desperate, delusional wave of hope washed over her face. She tried to rationalize what she had just heard. She looked up at him and asked if they needed to go pack her bags right now. She asked if he was taking her to Dubai so they could escape the bankruptcy together and start over. DeAndre could not look her in the eye. He stared firmly at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. I looked at my sister. The sheer delusion was almost fascinating to witness. I gave her a cold, calculated smile. I told Isabella that she should really pay closer attention to the details. I asked her if she heard DeAndre mention that the reservation to Dubai was booked for 2 passengers. I took a slow step forward and looked right into her horrified eyes. I told her that the second passenger's name on the itinerary was not Isabella. It was the name of his 24-year-old executive assistant. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. Isabella stood completely rigid, staring at the smartphone in my hand. Her mind was desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality of her situation. The luxurious life she had bragged about, the endless shopping sprees, the condescending attitude she used to make me feel worthless, it was all built on a massive foundation of lies. Her husband was not just bankrupt. He was a criminal fugitive who was planning to abandon her and flee to the Middle East with a woman 9 years younger than her. A sound ripped from Isabella's throat that I had never heard before. It was a primal, agonizing shriek of pure humiliation and rage. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into claws. She threw herself at DeAndre, slamming her fists against his chest. She screamed his name over and over, demanding to know how he could do this to her. She hit him with everything she had, sobbing hysterically that she had given him the best years of her life and he was leaving her for a cheap secretary. DeAndre did not try to comfort her. The charismatic, loving husband routine was completely gone. He grabbed her wrists and violently shoved her backward. Isabella stumbled, her high heels sliding on the slick marble floor, and she crashed into one of the heavy dining chairs. DeAndre glared down at her with absolute disgust. He told her she was a delusional, spoiled leech who had bled him dry. He shouted that his company might have survived if she had not demanded a new luxury car every year and private jets to the Bahamas. He screamed that while he was taking out predatory high-interest loans just to make his payroll, she was busy swiping credit cards to buy designer handbags to impress women at the country club who did not even like her. He told her he was glad to be leaving her behind because she was nothing but a heavy anchor dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. Isabella covered her face with her hands, weeping so hard she was gasping for air. The golden couple, the shining example of perfection that my mother had constantly compared me to, was physically and verbally tearing each other apart in front of half the neighborhood. The grand dining room was a scene of unparalleled devastation. Richard was still on his knees on the floor, weeping and pleading with the furious investors who were boxing him in. DeAndre was trying to adjust his ruined suit, his eyes darting frantically toward the patio doors, realizing his escape route was permanently blocked. Isabella was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. The wealthy guests who had not already fled were standing against the walls, watching the total annihilation of the Montgomery family in morbid fascination. Catherine realized she had lost completely. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her golden daughter was penniless and abandoned. The high society friends she had spent decades courting were staring at her with pure revulsion. The control she had wielded over this family like a weapon was entirely broken. When a narcissist loses control of the narrative, they always resort to the ultimate manipulation tactic. They make themselves the victim. Catherine suddenly grabbed the edge of the dining table. She let out a loud theatrical gasp. She clutched her hand tightly over her chest right above her heart. Her face contorted in exaggerated agony. She began taking short, rapid breaths, staggering backward until she collapsed heavily into one of the plush dining chairs. She cried out that she could not breathe. She wailed that the stress of my vicious lies was triggering a massive cardiac event. She looked around at the remaining guests with wide, terrified eyes, begging for someone to please call an ambulance before her own daughter killed her on her 60th birthday. A few of the guests shifted nervously. One man reached into his pocket for his phone, his face pale with concern. I took a sharp step forward and raised my hand. I locked eyes with the man holding the phone. I told him in a loud, commanding voice to put his phone away and not to dial emergency services. I announced to the room that there was absolutely nothing wrong with Catherine's heart. Catherine gasped louder, clutching her chest and looking at me with pure manufactured terror. She sobbed that I was a monster who wanted to watch her die. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I stared down at the woman who had made my life a living nightmare for over 2 decades. I kept my voice icy and surgical. I told the room that I had seen this exact performance 5 years ago. I reminded Catherine of the week I finally secured a final round interview for an executive position at one of the top financial firms in Manhattan. It was the opportunity that would have launched my career and given me enough money to finally move far away from her toxic grip. The morning of that interview, Catherine pulled this exact same stunt. She collapsed in the kitchen, clutching her chest, screaming that she was having a heart attack. I told the guests how I panicked. I abandoned my career-defining interview. I called an ambulance and rode with her to the hospital. I sat in a sterile waiting room for 2 agonizing days, terrified that I was going to lose my mother. I missed the interview and the firm hired someone else. I took another step toward Catherine, whose theatrical gasping was suddenly beginning to slow down. I told the room what the leading cardiologist at the hospital told me after running thousands of dollars worth of extensive tests. I revealed that Catherine had an incredibly strong, perfectly healthy heart. The doctor told me she had simply experienced a mild case of indigestion, likely brought on by drinking too much wine the night before. She had faked a life-threatening medical emergency just to sabotage my career and ensure I stayed trapped as her personal caretaker. Catherine stopped gasping entirely. Her hands slowly slid away from her chest. She stared at me, her face flashing from fake agony to genuine, furious panic as she realized her ultimate sympathy card had just been publicly burned to ashes. I told her she was going to need to find a new trick because nobody in this room was going to fall for her pathetic acting ever again. Before Catherine could try to formulate another lie to garner sympathy, Aunt Beatrice stepped away from the dining table. She walked confidently into the massive sunken living room that adjoined the dining area. The entire wall was dominated by a state-of-the-art 85-inch smart television that Richard used to show off his real estate promotional videos. Beatrice reached into her designer tote bag. She pulled out a small silver USB drive. She walked right up to the television and plugged the drive directly into the side port. She picked up the remote control from the coffee table and turned the massive screen on. Beatrice looked over her shoulder at my mother. Her voice was sharp and laced with dark amusement. She told Catherine that she did not need a doctor tonight. She told her she needed to start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney. Beatrice pointed the remote control at the television and said, "Look at the screen." The massive 85-inch television screen flared to life. The sudden burst of bright blue and white light illuminated the dark, tense living room. Every single eye in the room darted toward the screen. It was not a real estate promotional video or a family slideshow. It was a high-resolution scan of international banking documents. The logo at the top belonged to an exclusive, highly secretive offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. Printed in bold, undeniable black letters, right across the top of the primary account ledger was a single name, Catherine. I walked over to the television and stood next to Aunt Beatrice. I looked at my mother. Her face was completely drained of blood. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. I turned my attention to Richard, who was staring at the screen with absolute confusion. I told the room that for the last 20 years, everyone simply assumed Catherine was nothing more than a passive trophy wife. The high society circles believed she was just a woman who loved swiping credit cards, buying designer clothes, and turning a blind eye while her husband did the dirty work. I told them that was a massive underestimation of my mother. Catherine was never blind. She was the primary architect of her own contingency plan. I pointed to the glowing digital columns on the screen. I explained that I did not just audit Richard's commercial real estate fund, I audited the personal wealth transfers moving out of his accounts. I revealed that for the past 5 years, every time Richard stole money from a new investor to pay off an old one, a specific percentage of that stolen capital was quietly siphoned off the top. I looked directly at Richard. I told him his loving wife had been systematically draining his fraudulent accounts. She used a complex web of shell companies to wire those funds directly into these untouchable offshore accounts in the Caribbean. I told him to look closely at the balance on the screen. There was exactly $12 million sitting in that account. Richard blinked hard, his eyes straining against the bright light of the television. He squinted at the routing numbers and the signature authorizations. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat. I did not stop there. I delivered the final crushing blow to their marriage. I explained that the offshore accounts were not joint accounts. They were registered entirely under Catherine's maiden name. I told Richard that Catherine was not a fool. She knew his localized Ponzi scheme was mathematically unsustainable. She knew that eventually the cash flow would dry up, the investors would demand their returns, and the federal authorities would come knocking at their front door. I watched the devastating truth finally click into place inside Richard's mind. I told him that Catherine was never planning to stand by his side when the empire fell. She had secured her own escape hatch. The very second the Securities and Exchange Commission issued an indictment, Catherine was going to file for divorce claim. She was an innocent victim who had no idea about his crimes and board a first-class flight to a country with no extradition treaty. She was going to let Richard take the sole fall and rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life while she lived like a queen on the money he stole. Richard slowly turned his head away from the television screen. He looked at Catherine. The transition on his face was terrifying. The panicked, desperate man who had just been crying on the floor vanished. He was replaced by a man consumed by pure, unadulterated rage. The betrayal cut him deeper than the bankruptcy, deeper than the frozen assets, and deeper than the public humiliation. The woman he had lied for, the woman he had committed federal crimes to keep draped in diamonds and pearls, had been plotting to throw him to the wolves. Richard took a heavy, menacing step toward her. Catherine scrambled backward, her expensive heels slipping on the marble floor. She held her hands up defensively, shaking her head violently. She stammered that the documents on the screen were forged. She cried out that I was trying to frame her to destroy their marriage. She swore to Richard that she loved him and would never do such a thing. Richard did not believe a single word. He recognized the offshore routing numbers. He remembered the specific dates of the wire transfers I had highlighted on the screen. He backed her right into the corner of the living room, trapping her against the heavy velvet drapes. He roared at her, his voice shaking the crystal fixtures on the walls. He called her a traitor. He screamed that he had risked his entire freedom just to give her the luxurious life she demanded. He shouted that he had destroyed innocent people's finances just to pay for her country club memberships and her European vacations. He slammed his fist against the wall right next to her head, screaming that she was a parasite who had been bleeding him dry while planning to leave him in a concrete cell. Catherine cowered against the wall, weeping hysterically, unable to formulate another lie. Isabella and DeAndre were standing near the archway, completely stunned by the absolute destruction of their parents. The wealthy guests who had lingered to watch the drama unfold were now rapidly backing away, realizing the situation was escalating from a financial scandal into something deeply dangerous. Richard backed away from Catherine. His chest was heaving. His eyes darted wildly around the room. He looked at the angry investors who were still blocking the front doors. He looked at the television screen displaying his financial ruin. He looked at me standing calmly next to Aunt Beatrice. He realized his entire life was completely over. He had no money, no company, no allies, and a wife who had been planning to betray him. He was a cornered animal with absolutely nothing left to lose. Richard let out a ragged, desperate breath. He suddenly bent down, reaching under the hem of his tailored suit trousers. Several guests screamed as Richard pulled a small black handgun from a concealed ankle holster. He stood up straight, his hand shaking violently, and pointed the weapon directly at the high vaulted ceiling. He screamed at the top of his lungs, ordering every single person in the house to freeze. He shouted for nobody to move a single muscle, declaring that he still had leverage. The sound of Richard drawing the weapon sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the grand living room. The wealthy guests who had been screaming at him just moments ago instantly dropped to the marble floor. Women in expensive designer gowns covered their heads and wept. Men who prided themselves on their power and influence scrambled under the dining tables, desperately trying to shield themselves from the unhinged real estate mogul. I watched as DeAndre, the man who loved to play the intimidating alpha male, threw himself onto his hands and knees. He crawled frantically across the floor and cowered behind a heavy velvet sofa, trembling in pure cowardice. Isabella was curled into a tight ball near the archway, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. The high society birthday party had officially devolved into a hostage situation. I did not drop to the floor. I did not run. I stood perfectly still next to Aunt Beatrice, my posture completely relaxed. Richard lowered the gun from the ceiling. His hands were shaking violently. He pointed the barrel directly at my chest. His breath hitched in his throat, coming out in ragged, desperate gasps. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of his ruined dress shirt. I told me I thought I was so incredibly smart. He screamed that I thought I could just walk into his house, freeze his bank accounts, and take his entire empire away without a fight. A wet, desperate laugh escaped his lips. He told me I was nothing but a naive little girl who did not know how the real world worked. He shouted that he might be locked out of his finances, but he still held the ultimate trump card. Richard took a shaky step forward, keeping the gun leveled at me. He demanded that everyone listen to him very carefully. He announced that there was a hidden wall safe in the darkest, most secure corner of the basement. It was a safe that nobody knew about, not even the private cleaning staff. He gloated that inside that safe was a mountain of highly classified corporate documents. He proudly confessed that 20 years ago he paid off a team of crooked auditors to fabricate a massive, undeniable paper trail. These forged documents were meticulously designed to frame my late biological father for international wire fraud and severe corporate espionage. Richard's eyes were wild and bloodshot. He screamed that if those documents ever saw the light of day, my father's pristine legacy would be burned to ash. The federal authorities would posthumously strip his name from every charity, every hospital wing, and every philanthropic foundation he ever built. The family name would become entirely synonymous with treason and disgrace. He turned his weapon, slightly pointing it down at Catherine, who was weeping hysterically on the floor. Richard told the terrified room that this was the real reason his wife never left him. This was the exact reason Catherine allowed him to spend her money, why she helped him hide the stolen investor capital, and why she looked the other way while he ruined people's lives. He had held those forged documents over Catherine's head for 2 decades. He told her that if she ever stepped out of line, if she ever tried to divorce him or expose his localized Ponzi scheme, he would release the files to the media. He would destroy the very social standing and high society reputation she worshipped more than her own children. Catherine sobbed louder, burying her face in her hands, completely shattered by the public exposure of her deepest, darkest secret. Richard snapped his attention back to me. The gun trembled in his sweaty grip. He demanded that I reach into my pocket and pull out my phone right now. He ordered me to call the legal team at Vanguard Capital and unfreeze every single corporate account immediately. He promised that if I did not restore his full access to the funds and secure him a safe, untraceable flight out of the country, he would leak the fabricated files to the press tomorrow morning. He swore he would make sure my biological father was remembered as a disgraced criminal. I stared right down the barrel of the gun. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for the pathetic, broken man standing in front of me. I kept my voice incredibly calm and measured. I asked Richard if he honestly believed that a 33-year-old senior partner at a private equity firm would initiate a hostile financial takeover without securing all the loose ends first. I asked him if he really thought I would walk into a room full of enemies without completely neutralizing his only piece of leverage. Richard frowned, his heavy brow furrowing in confusion. He demanded to know what I was talking about. I did not break eye contact with him. I slowly reached down into my oversized designer tote bag, my fingers wrapped around a cold, heavy object resting at the very bottom. I pulled it out and held it up under the bright crystal chandeliers for him to see. It was a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. The hinges were completely shattered. The thick steel was bent and twisted outward by brute force. I let go of the box. I dropped it directly onto the hard marble floor. The heavy metallic thud echoed sharply through the silent, terrified dining room. I gave Richard a cold, empty smile. I asked him if he meant this safe. I asked him if this was the exact safe I had my private investigators drill open 3 hours ago. The sound of the rusted metal lockbox striking the marble floor echoed like a gunshot through the silent dining room. Richard flinched. The heavy black handgun in his sweaty grip wavered, the barrel lowering just a fraction of an inch as sheer, unadulterated shock washed over his face. He stared down at the broken steel box, his mouth hanging open. I took a slow step forward. I kept my eyes locked on the pathetic man who had tormented me for 2 decades. I asked him if he really thought a dusty wall safe hidden behind a wine rack in the basement was going to stop a professional forensic audit. I told him my private investigators bypassed his cheap biometric lock in less than 10 minutes. I brought the box up to my office at Vanguard Capital, and I spent the entire afternoon reading through his precious, highly classified documents. Richard swallowed hard. His chest was heaving. He tried to raise the gun back up to my chest, but his arm was shaking so violently he could barely keep it straight. He stuttered, demanding that I give the files back to him immediately. He screamed that those documents were his property, and I had no right to touch them. I let out a cold laugh. I told him those documents were not his property. They were his confession. I looked around the room, making sure Catherine Isabella and the cowering guests were hanging on my every word. I explained that Richard had always bragged about his brilliant real estate mind. He loved telling the high society circles that he outsmarted my biological father in the commercial market. He loved claiming that my father was too weak to handle the pressure of the industry, which led to his failing business and his fatal heart attack. I turned my gaze back to Richard. I told the room that the files inside that broken lockbox told a completely different story. I revealed that it was not evidence of my father committing corporate espionage. It was undeniable hard proof that Richard was the one who orchestrated a massive illegal supply chain sabotage against my father's company. I listed the exact details I had memorized from the files. I explained how Richard bribed 3 separate shipping directors to permanently delay my father's international materials. I detailed how Richard paid off safety inspectors to falsely flag my father's commercial development sites, causing millions of dollars in fake regulatory fines. Aunt Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fierce protective fury for her late brother. She pointed at Richard and told the room that he did not outsmart anyone. He systematically destroyed an honest man through criminal sabotage. I kept my voice loud and unwavering. I told the terrified crowd that my father did not die from natural industry stress. He died because Richard spent 3 years suffocating his business, draining his resources, and driving him to the absolute brink of total ruin. I looked Richard dead in the eye and told him he practically murdered his business rival just so he could swoop in, steal his grieving wife, and hijack his remaining wealth to build his own fraudulent empire. A loud gasp tore through the dining room. It did not come from the guests. It came from Catherine. I looked over at my mother. She was slumped against the wall, her face completely ashen. Her hands were trembling as she pressed them over her mouth. For the first time in my entire life, the look of horror on Catherine's face was 100% genuine. She stared at Richard as if she were looking at a monster. Catherine was a greedy, manipulative woman who loved money more than she loved her own daughter, but she actually did not know this part of the story. She always believed Richard was just a ruthless businessman who swooped in to save her after her first husband failed. She never knew that the man she slept next to for the last 20 years was the exact reason her first husband was in the ground. Catherine let out a choked sob. She asked Richard if it was true. She demanded to know if he had killed the father of her child just to get his hands on the estate. Richard did not answer her. He could not even look at her. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He looked down at the broken lockbox on the floor. He finally realized that his ultimate blackmail material, the secret he thought would protect him forever, was actually a documented murder weapon with his fingerprints all over it. He had carefully preserved the exact evidence needed to send him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. DeAndre whined from behind the velvet sofa, begging someone to just let him leave. Isabella was rocking back and forth on the floor, completely broken by the reality that her entire luxurious existence was funded by the blood of my father. Richard let out a primal, desperate roar of pure panic. He raised the gun again, pointing it wildly at me, then at Beatrice, and then at the front doors. He screamed that he was not going to prison. He shouted that he was walking out of this house tonight, and if anyone tried to stop him, he would shoot. He demanded that I kick the lockbox over to him right now. I did not move. I did not kick the box. I just looked at him with a calm, satisfied smile. I told him he was not walking anywhere. Before Richard could take another step toward the broken lockbox, a blinding flash of color erupted from outside the grand bay windows. Brilliant, piercing flashes of red and blue lights suddenly flooded the dining room, sweeping aggressively across the crystal chandeliers and the marble floor. The intense rotating strobe lights cut through the darkness of the estate grounds, illuminating the terrified faces of the remaining guests. A split second later, the deafening high-pitched wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet night air. The piercing sound surrounded the entire Hamptons estate, echoing from the front gates all the way up the circular driveway. Richard froze the gun, trembling uselessly in his hand, as the reality of his inescapable destruction finally arrived at his front door. The heavy oak front doors of the Hamptons estate did not just open, they were violently breached. A specialized tactical unit of heavily armed police officers and federal agents poured into the grand foyer. The sound of heavy combat boots hitting the pristine marble floor echoed through the house like a stampede. Commands were shouted clear and authoritative, cutting right through the lingering panic in the dining room. Bright white flashlights attached to tactical rifles pierced the dim, moody lighting of this birthday party, sweeping aggressively across the terrified faces of the remaining high society guests. The officers swarmed the dining room in seconds. Bright red laser sights danced across Richard's frosting-stained suit jacket. The lead tactical officer commanded him to drop the weapon immediately and get on the ground. Richard was completely paralyzed by sheer suffocating fear. His fingers went numb. The heavy black handgun slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering uselessly against the hardwood floorboards. Before Richard could even attempt to lower himself to his knees, two federal agents tackled him. They hit him with enough force to knock the wind completely out of his lungs. They forced the mighty, untouchable real estate mogul face first into the spilled champagne and ruined caviar scattered across the floor. His cheek was pressed hard against the cold stone. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists signaled the absolute end of his fraudulent empire. He let out a pathetic, broken whimper that completely destroyed whatever illusion of power he had left. The wealthy investors and socialites pressed themselves flat against the walls, raising their hands high in the air, desperate to show the federal agents they were not involved in the hostility. DeAndre remained curled into a tight ball behind the velvet sofa, trembling uncontrollably as armed agents swept the perimeter of the living room. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing into her knees, completely unable to cope with the reality of police raiding her childhood home. But Patricia saw an opportunity. My mother, the woman who had spent 2 decades covering for a murderer and a fraud, instantly flipped a switch in her mind. She realized her husband was going to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life, and her venomous survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She scrambled up from the floor, smoothing down her expensive designer dress. She forced fresh, glossy tears into her eyes and let out a dramatic, trembling wail. She rushed toward the lead police officers, holding her hands out as if she were a rescued hostage finally escaping her captor. She cried out that they had arrived just in time. She sobbed heavily, claiming that Richard had completely lost his mind and held them all hostage at gunpoint. She pointed an accusing, shaking finger at her husband, who was currently being dragged to his feet by 2 unsmiling federal agents. She screamed that Richard was a monster, a complete psychopath who had been hiding his horrific financial crimes from her for years. She claimed she was just a devoted, innocent wife who had absolutely no idea where the money came from or what he was doing behind closed doors. She placed a hand over her heart, breathing heavily, and thanked the officers for saving her life from a madman. The officers did not offer her a warm blanket or a reassuring pat on the shoulder. They simply parted to make way for a woman in a dark windbreaker bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI. The federal agent was a tall, severe-looking woman who carried herself with absolute authority. She did not look at Patricia with a single ounce of sympathy. She looked at her like a predator examining a trapped rodent. The agent stopped 2 feet away from my mother. She held up a secure federal tablet. She told Patricia to save the terrible acting for the judge. She tapped the screen of her tablet and held it up high so my mother could clearly see the brightly colored graphs and data logs displaying on the device. The agent kept her voice loud, making sure the entire room heard every single word of the takedown. She explained that the federal government had been closely monitoring a very specific set of offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands. She revealed that they had been tracking the digital footprints and IP addresses accessing those exact accounts for the past 6 months. The agent leaned in closer to Patricia, her gaze piercing right through my mother's fake tears. She stated that every single login attempt, every digital wire transfer, and every secure viewing of those hidden offshore funds originated from the primary IP address, registered directly to Patricia's personal smartphone and her private laptop in the master bedroom upstairs. Patricia gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her face went completely blank. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. She finally stuttered, asking how the federal government could possibly bypass the highly encrypted firewalls of a private offshore banking institution. The FBI agent did not look at Patricia when she answered. She looked directly across the dining room. She locked eyes with me. The agent announced to the room that federal investigators received a highly detailed, fully verified, anonymous tip from the Compliance Division at Vanguard Capital. She confirmed that the tip included every encrypted routing number, every hidden shell company, and a complete, undeniable map of Patricia's personal digital activity. Patricia slowly turned her head. She looked at me standing calmly next to Aunt Beatrice. The absolute horror of her situation finally took root in her mind. I had not just frozen the corporate accounts. I had meticulously documented her entire escape plan and handed her directly to the federal government on a silver platter. I gave her a small, polite nod. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless cry. She turned back to the FBI agent and tried to raise her hands to beg for mercy, opening her mouth to fabricate one last desperate lie. The agent did not hesitate. She reached to her heavy utility belt and pulled out a second pair of thick steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed through the grand dining room, sealing my mother's fate. The agent grabbed Patricia's wrist roughly and twisted her arms behind her back. Patricia's expensive pearl necklace caught on the agent's vest and snapped. Dozens of white pearls scattered across the marble floor, bouncing away into the dark corners of the room. The agent announced in a loud, commanding voice that Patricia was officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and severe tax evasion. The metallic click of the second pair of handcuffs snapping shut around Patricia's wrists echoed with absolute finality. The remaining high society guests watched in stunned, breathless silence as the untouchable matriarch of the Montgomery family was reduced to a common criminal. Patricia stood completely frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief as an FBI agent recited her Miranda rights. Richard was already being hauled to his feet by 2 tactical officers, his expensive suit stained with cake frosting and spilled bourbon. While every single eye in the dining room was glued to the spectacular downfall of the parents, Isabella was experiencing a completely different kind of terror. She stood near the archway, her body trembling violently. She looked at her mother in handcuffs. She looked at her father being marched toward the front door. She looked at DeAndre, the husband who had just confessed to being a bankrupt fraud, planning to abandon her for a younger woman. The horrifying, suffocating reality of her situation suddenly crashed down upon her shoulders. Isabella realized she had absolutely no money, no credit, no assets, and no one left to bankroll her luxurious existence. She was completely destitute. Isabella slowly backed away from the archway. The police officers and federal agents were entirely focused on securing Richard Patricia and the massive dining area. Nobody was paying attention to the golden child. She slipped quietly out of the living room and hurried into the dim, elegant expanse of the grand hallway. Her eyes darted wildly around the lavishly decorated corridor. She needed cash. She needed something untraceable that she could pawn or sell immediately just to survive the night and hire a defense attorney. She spotted a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags sitting near the kitchen doors, abandoned by the furious catering staff when they evacuated the property. She snatched a bag and practically sprinted down the hallway. She stopped abruptly in front of a small, heavily illuminated alcove. Hanging proudly on the wall was an original authenticated Picasso sketch. Richard had purchased it at a high-end charity auction 5 years ago, constantly bragging to his country club friends that it was worth at least $2 million. Isabella did not care about the cultural significance of the artwork. She only saw her ticket out of poverty. She reached up with trembling hands and grabbed the thick gilded gold frame. The painting was incredibly heavy, secured to the wall with reinforced steel wire. Isabella gritted her teeth, ignoring the fact that she was ruining her expensive manicure. She pulled with all her might, letting out a sharp grunt of exertion. The steel wire snapped. The heavy frame came off the wall, and Isabella staggered backward, clutching the priceless artwork to her chest. She quickly dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She shook open the heavy-duty black trash bag and frantically tried to stuff the massive gold frame inside. She was hyperventilating, muttering to herself that she just needed to get to a pawn shop, that she just needed a few $100,000 to start over somewhere else. A shadow suddenly fell over her. Aunt Beatrice stood directly above Isabella. She looked down at my sister with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Beatrice asked Isabella if she was really trying to stuff a $2 million masterpiece into a garbage bag like a common street thief. Isabella gasped and scrambled backward, pulling the trash bag tightly against her chest. Her face was red and blotchy, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She glared up at Beatrice and screamed that the painting belonged to her family. She shouted that she was the rightful heir to this estate, and she deserved to take at least one thing with her. Beatrice did not waste time arguing. She took a swift, commanding step forward. She reached down and violently ripped the heavy gold frame right out of Isabella's hands. The trash bag tore in half, spilling the priceless Picasso onto the floor between them. Isabella let out a shrill, agonizing shriek. She lunged forward, trying to claw the painting back, but Beatrice easily shoved her away. Isabella collapsed onto the floor, weeping hysterically. She threw a full childish tantrum right there in the hallway. She pounded her fists against the hardwood floor. She screamed that it was not fair. She cried out that she had no money, her credit was ruined, and she did not even have a car anymore. She looked up at Beatrice with wild, desperate eyes and yelled that she refused to be poor. She claimed she was not built to work a normal job, and she would rather die than live like a regular person. I walked into the hallway just in time to hear her pathetic declaration. I was followed closely by a uniformed police officer who had heard the shouting from the dining room. I looked down at my sister, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who had tormented me my entire life. I told Isabella she was going to have to get used to living like a regular person very quickly. I stepped over the torn trash bag and looked at the police officer. I kept my voice perfectly calm and professional. I pointed down at the Picasso sketch resting on the floor. I informed the officer that the artwork was purchased using funds directly siphoned from my biological father's blind trust. Therefore, as the sole legal owner of the trust assets, the painting belonged exclusively to me. I looked back down at Isabella. I told the officer that my sister was actively attempting to steal $2 million of my personal property and sneak it out the back door in a garbage bag. Isabella froze. Her hysterical sobbing stopped instantly. The color completely drained from her face as she looked from me to the police officer. She stammered, shaking her head, claiming it was just a misunderstanding, and she was only trying to pack her personal belongings. The police officer did not buy a single word of her excuse. He looked at the torn trash bag, the empty space on the wall, and the priceless artwork on the floor. He reached down and grabbed Isabella firmly by the arm, hauling her to her feet with zero gentleness. He turned his head and called out to another officer down the hall. He told his partner to add attempted grand larceny to the official report. Isabella let out a deafening, piercing scream. She tried to pull her arm away, begging and pleading with me to tell the officer it was a joke. She cried out that I was her sister and I could not possibly let them arrest her. I gave her a cold, empty smile. I reminded her that she had just spent the last 20 minutes calling me the help, and the help does not protect thieves. The officer forcibly spun Isabella around. He pulled her arms behind her back. The sharp, unmistakable sound of a third pair of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed down the grand hallway. Isabella collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably in her ruined designer gown, finally realizing that her golden privilege had just completely expired. C. As the officers guided her through the archway, Isabella stopped walking. She looked across the chaotic room and locked eyes with DeAndre. She saw him standing at the patio table. She saw the legal documents scattered across the glass. She saw him bowing his head in total pathetic submission to the sister she had tormented her entire life. The realization hit Isabella with the force of a freight train. Her husband had not tried to save her. He had not fought for her or their marriage. He had sold his soul to me just to save his own skin. Isabella glared at DeAndre with pure concentrated venom. The absolute betrayal radiated from her tear-stained face. She leaned forward and spat directly onto his expensive leather shoes. The illusion of the golden power couple shattered completely, leaving nothing but ruin and absolute disgust in its wake. The sharp sting of Isabella spitting on DeAndre's shoes was the final pathetic act of their broken marriage. The tactical officers did not give them a single second to recover from the humiliation. They grabbed DeAndre by the shoulders of his sweat-soaked navy suit and shoved him forward. Isabella was yanked in the opposite direction, her ruined designer gown dragging across the marble floor. I walked slowly toward the grand archway of the dining room and watched the procession move out through the heavy oak front doors. The sprawling circular driveway of the Hamptons estate was completely illuminated by the aggressive rotating red and blue lights of multiple federal vehicles. The cold night air rushed into the house carrying the sharp crackle of police radios. I stood on the top step of the front porch with Aunt Beatrice by my side, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tormented me my entire life. There were 4 separate squad cars parked in a neat row across the gravel. The federal agents were not taking any chances with collusion. They packed each member of my toxic family into the back of a different vehicle. I watched as Richard was forcefully folded into the back of the first cruiser. His face was pressed against the reinforced glass window. I was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and vacant, completely broken by the reality that his entire identity as a real estate mogul was nothing but a fraudulent illusion that had just earned him a lifetime in a federal penitentiary. Catherine was shoved into the second car. She was no longer crying. The theatrical, manipulative tears had completely dried up. She sat in the dark back seat, her hands bound tightly in steel handcuffs, staring blankly ahead. The untouchable matriarch of high society was finally going to a place where her designer labels and offshore accounts could not save her. Isabella and DeAndre were loaded into the final 2 vehicles. They did not even look at each other. The heavy car doors slammed shut in rapid succession. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a series of vault doors locking forever. The police sirens wailed into the night, and the convoy of flashing lights accelerated down the long driveway, disappearing past the front gates. They were gone. The parasites had finally been forcibly removed from my father's house. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the cool ocean air. I turned around and walked back into the grand foyer. The dining room was a catastrophic disaster zone of crushed vanilla cake, shattered crystal wine glasses, and abandoned luxury jackets. But the house was not entirely empty. A small cluster of the ultra-wealthy elite still remained. These were the high society guests who had not managed to sprint out the door when the federal agents first breached the property. They were the venture capitalists, the charity board directors, and the socialites who spent decades kissing Catherine's ring and funding Richard's fake empire. When I walked back into the room, they did not scramble for the exit. Instead, they completely shifted their tactics. Their survival instincts kicked in, driven by pure, unadulterated greed. A silver-haired venture capitalist stepped forward, smoothing his expensive silk tie. He forced an incredibly eager, sycophantic smile onto his face. He walked right up to me and held out his hand as if we were old friends. He told me he was absolutely horrified by what my family had put me through. He swore to me that he always suspected Richard was a crooked fraud, and he claimed he only attended this birthday party out of pure social obligation. He lowered his voice, trying to sound intimate and supportive. He told me he always knew I was the smart one in the family. He said he had deeply admired my quiet intelligence for years. A wealthy socialite draped in diamonds quickly stepped up beside him. She nodded enthusiastically, letting out a highly manufactured sigh of sympathy. She insisted that she never actually liked Catherine. She claimed my mother was a cruel, tacky woman and that high society only tolerated her because of her loud money. They began crowding around me. They were tripping over each other, reaching into their tailored pockets and designer clutches to pull out their premium embossed business cards. They aggressively offered me private lunches at exclusive country clubs. They promised to introduce me to their inner circles. They were acting as if they did not just participate in my public humiliation less than 2 hours ago. They knew exactly who I was now. I was not just the family scapegoat anymore. I was a senior partner at Vanguard Capital, a woman who controlled billions of dollars in private equity. They were desperately trying to pivot, hoping to save their own business connections and secure future investments from my firm. I looked at the eager, greedy faces pressing in on me. I did not take a single one of their business cards. I did not shake the venture capitalist's outstretched hand. My expression turned to absolute stone. I looked down at the marble floor, right at the exact spot where the mustard-stained paper plate had landed earlier this evening. I remembered the deafening sound of their laughter. I remembered how every single one of these people had raised their crystal champagne flutes and chuckled when Richard handed me a hot dog and told me the help eats outside. They did not defend me then. They delighted in my degradation because it made them feel superior. I raised my head and locked eyes with the venture capitalist. The cold, unyielding power in my gaze made him physically flinch and take a step backward. I kept my voice perfectly flat and surgical. I told them their fake apologies were completely worthless. I told them they were nothing but spineless, opportunistic scavengers feeding off the scraps of whoever held the most power in the room. I announced that starting tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Vanguard Capital would officially sever all financial ties and completely dissolve all joint ventures with every single person standing in this dining room. I promised them their investment portfolios would be liquidated without hesitation. I told them I was personally ensuring that every name in this room was permanently blacklisted from every major private equity firm on the entire East Coast. The sycophantic smiles vanished instantly. The color drained from their faces, replaced by sheer panic and profound, suffocating humiliation. They realized they had not just backed the wrong horse. They had actively mocked the woman who held their financial futures in the palm of her hand. I raised my arm. I pointed my finger methodically toward the heavy oak front doors. I told them to get off my property immediately. Nobody argued. Nobody tried to hand me another business card. The wealthy guests scrambled frantically for the exit, pushing past each other in total disgrace just to escape my wrath. They kept their heads down, scurrying out the front doors like terrified mice fleeing a burning building. The sound of luxury car engines aggressively revving in the driveway faded quickly into the distance. Finally, the massive Hamptons estate fell completely and utterly silent. The flashing lights were gone, the screaming was over. The suffocating presence of my toxic family had been entirely eradicated. I slowly lowered my arm. I stood in the center of the ruined dining room, breathing in the quiet peace of absolute victory. Aunt Beatrice walked over and stood firmly by my side. We were the only two people left standing in the ruins of the Montgomery Empire. The heavy oak front doors remained firmly shut, sealing out the cold night air and the distant wail of police sirens. For the first time in my entire life, the sprawling Hamptons estate was completely and utterly silent. The suffocating presence of my toxic family, the fake laughter, the cruel remarks, the endless desperate need to impress high society strangers, it was all entirely eradicated. I stood in the center of the ruined dining room and let the profound quiet wash over me. The space looked like the aftermath of a localized hurricane. Smashed crystal goblets littered the marble floor. The three-tier vanilla birthday cake was a destroyed sticky mess, melting into the fine linen tablecloth. Expensive suit jackets and designer clutches had been carelessly abandoned on the chairs by the fleeing guests. I walked slowly across the room, my high heels stepping carefully over the debris. I stopped at the exact spot near the archway where I had been standing 2 hours ago. I looked down at the floor. Resting against the baseboard was the cheap, flimsy paper plate Richard had shoved into my chest. The bright yellow mustard was dried and smeared across the white paper rim. I bent down and picked it up. I held the flimsy cardboard in my hands, feeling the stark contrast between this cheap piece of trash and the billions of dollars in private equity I controlled. I walked over to the massive stone fireplace that anchored the far end of the dining room. The gas fire was still burning brightly, casting warm orange shadows across the wreckage. I tossed the paper plate directly into the center of the flames. I stood there and watched the edges of the plate curl, blacken, and ignite. The bright yellow mustard bubbled for a fraction of a second before the entire thing was consumed by the fire, turning into nothing but gray ash floating up the chimney. As the plate disappeared, something inside me finally gave way. The cold, calculated armor of the senior partner that I had worn all night suddenly began to crack. The adrenaline that had fueled my hostile takeover rapidly drained from my bloodstream, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming wave of physical and emotional exhaustion. 2 decades of relentless psychological abuse crashed down onto my shoulders all at once. I remembered the damp chill of the unfinished basement. I remembered the sheer panic of having my college funds stolen. I remembered every single time Patricia looked at me with pure disgust, simply because I existed. I had won the war, I had completely decimated the people who tried to bury me, but the victory did not erase the fact that I had to wage war against my own mother just to survive. My vision blurred. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. I felt a warm, strong hand rest gently on my shoulder. Aunt Beatrice stepped up beside me. She did not offer empty platitudes or tell me not to cry. She simply wrapped her arms around me and pulled me into a fierce, grounding embrace. She smelled of expensive perfume and the crisp ocean air. Beatrice held me tight and let me quietly shed the tears I had refused to show my abusers. She stroked my hair and spoke in a soft, steady voice. She told me I did it. She told me I broke the curse that had infected this family for 20 years. She validated every single ounce of my strength, whispering that my biological father would be so incredibly proud of the unbreakable woman I had become. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped my face, pulling back from the embrace. I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit. I thanked her, my voice returning to its normal, steady cadence. Beatrice gave me a warm, proud smile. Then her expression shifted back into a mask of sharp determination. She adjusted the belt of her emerald green trench coat and looked toward the grand hallway. She told me to dry my eyes completely because the night was not quite over yet. She said there was one last thing my biological father left behind, and it was time for me to claim it. I frowned in confusion, asking her what else could possibly be left. The blind trust had already transferred everything into my name. Beatrice did not answer. She simply gestured for me to follow her. We walked out of the destroyed dining room, moving down the long, silent corridor of the estate. We passed the formal sitting rooms and the grand staircase, eventually arriving at the heavy mahogany doors of the private library. I pushed the doors open. The library was a massive 2-story room lined from floor to ceiling with dark wood bookshelves and thousands of leather-bound volumes. Richard had always used this room as his personal sanctuary. He loved to sit behind the massive executive desk, drinking expensive bourbon, and pretending he was a brilliant, highly educated real estate mogul. The ultimate irony was that Richard never actually read a single book in this room. He bought the entire collection in bulk just to make himself look smart to his wealthy friends. Beatrice walked purposefully past Richard's desk. She moved toward the back corner of the library, approaching a specific section of built-in shelving that housed heavy encyclopedias. She ran her hand along the polished wood paneling separating two of the massive shelves. She told me that Richard was an arrogant, unobservant fool who lived in this house for 2 decades and never bothered to learn its secrets. My father, she explained, actually built this estate, and he was a man who appreciated hidden contingencies. Beatrice pressed her thumb firmly against a small, intricately carved wooden rosette embedded in the decorative trim. A sharp mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet library. I watched in sheer amazement as a vertical section of the heavy mahogany bookshelf suddenly unlatched. Beatrice pulled the edge of the wood, and the entire section of shelving swung smoothly outward on hidden steel hinges, revealing a dark recessed cavity built directly into the reinforced wall structure. I stepped closer, peering into the hidden compartment. Resting on a small velvet shelf inside the dark cavity was a pristine, highly polished wooden box. It was crafted from rich dark walnut and secured with a heavy brass lock. It looked completely untouched by time, entirely safe from Richard's greedy, wandering hands. Beatrice reached into the compartment and carefully lifted the heavy wooden box. She carried it over to Richard's desk and set it down right on top of his leather blotter. She reached deep into the pocket of her trench coat. She pulled out an old, intricately designed brass key attached to a faded silk ribbon. She held the key up in the dim light of the library, looking at it with a mixture of reverence and deep sorrow. Beatrice reached out and placed the cold brass key directly into the palm of my hand. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice filled with absolute, unwavering certainty. She told me my father gave her this key 20 years ago. She said he made her swear on her life to keep it hidden, and he gave her one very specific instruction. Your father told me to give this to you when the house was finally cleansed of parasites. I looked down at the heavy brass key resting in the palm of my hand. The faded silk ribbon attached to it felt fragile against my skin, a stark contrast to the immense power it held. Aunt Beatrice watched me with a quiet, knowing expression. She took a step back, giving me the physical space I needed to process the weight of this exact moment. I turned my attention back to the dark walnut box sitting perfectly centered on the massive mahogany desk. This was the desk Richard had proudly claimed as his own for 2 decades, completely unaware that a secret compartment containing his ultimate ruin was resting just a few feet away. I took a deep breath, inserted the brass key into the old lock, and turned it. A sharp, satisfying metallic click broke the heavy silence of the massive library. I slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid. The inside of the box was lined with deep burgundy velvet that smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Resting neatly at the bottom was a thick stack of folded parchment paper. The top sheet was covered in my biological father's familiar, elegant handwriting. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. I carefully reached in, picked up the letter, and unfolded it. Beatrice stood silently by the towering bookshelf, her hands folded respectfully in front of her emerald green trench coat. I cleared my throat and began to read the letter aloud. My father's words echoed in the quiet, empty mansion, filling the space with a warmth I had not felt since I was a child. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the 33-year trust had successfully matured, and the house had finally been purged of the toxic people who sought to destroy our legacy. He wrote that he always knew exactly who Catherine was. He knew long before his untimely death that my mother was entirely consumed by greed and superficial status. He knew she would inevitably betray his memory and try to siphon his hard-earned wealth to fund her own selfish vanity. My voice wavered slightly as I read the next paragraph, but I forced myself to stay steady. My father wrote that it broke his heart to leave me alone with her. He knew I was going to suffer. He knew my mother would treat me poorly, push me aside, and prioritize her own luxurious comfort over my basic well-being. He confessed that he easily could have left the money directly to me at age 18. He could have made me instantly wealthy the moment I became a legal adult, allowing me to escape the house immediately. But he explicitly chose not to do that. He wrote that he deliberately structured the blind trust with a 33-year lock because he was terrified of what the toxic wealth would do to me if I received it too early. He had watched unearned money completely rot Catherine from the inside out, and he absolutely refused to let that happen to his only daughter. He wanted me to grow up hungry for success. He wanted me to face severe adversity, to learn the undeniable value of hard work, and to build my own unshakable foundation from the ground up. He wrote that he needed me to become incredibly tough, highly educated, and entirely independent. He knew that surviving Catherine, and whoever she brought into our home, would forge me into a razor-sharp weapon. He wanted me to become a woman who could not be bought, manipulated, intimidated, or broken by anybody in the corporate world or in high society. Hearing those words from beyond the grave felt like a massive physical weight lifting off my chest. Every long night studying every humiliating moment, sleeping in the damp, unfinished basement. Every 80-hour work week I endured at Vanguard Capital suddenly possessed a profound, undeniable purpose. I had not just survived their abuse, I had become exactly the fierce warrior my father needed me to be. I finished reading the last line of the letter, wiping a single stray tear from my jaw. But the wooden box was not empty. Beneath the letter sat a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with dark red wax. I set the letter down and picked up the envelope. I broke the heavy wax seal and slid the contents out onto the leather desk blotter. They were property deeds, dozens of them. They were printed on thick official state paper and stamped with multiple municipal government seals. I scanned the addresses listed on the deeds. My eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. These were not random residential properties or small commercial lots. They were massive, highly coveted commercial high-rises located directly in the heart of Manhattan. I flipped through the pages, recognizing premium zoning locations in Midtown and the financial district. I looked up at Aunt Beatrice, completely stunned by what I was holding. I asked her what these documents actually meant. Beatrice gave me a brilliant, triumphant smile. She explained that my father knew Richard would eventually try to play the role of a real estate tycoon using the visible assets from the primary trust. So my father quietly took a massive portion of his early capital and invested it entirely off the books. He spent years building an invisible commercial real estate empire in New York City, shielding every single transaction behind a complex labyrinth of anonymous shell corporations and proxy holding companies. Richard and Catherine never had the slightest clue this massive empire even existed. They thought they had stolen the entire pie while they were actually just fighting over the crumbs. I looked back down at the thick stack of deeds resting on the desk. I calculated the total square footage and the prime Manhattan zoning locations in my head. The financial numbers were absolutely staggering. The Hamptons estate and the downtown properties that Richard had proudly paraded around were basically loose change compared to the true overwhelming value of my father's secret portfolio. I touched the heavy parchment paper, a surge of absolute power coursing through my veins. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I was no longer just a wealthy private equity partner holding my mother's purse strings. As of tonight, I was officially one of the most powerful, undisputed real estate magnates in the entire state of New York. The 20 years of silent suffering, the endless humiliation, and the relentless emotional abuse had not just been vindicated, they had been conquered. I owned the board. I owned the pieces, and I had officially won the entire game. Exactly 2 weeks passed since the flashing red and blue police lights illuminated the Hamptons estate. I sat in the back row of a freezing windowless federal courtroom in downtown Manhattan. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue power suit. I did not look like the quiet, invisible daughter anymore. I looked exactly like what I was. I was a highly successful senior partner at Vanguard Capital and the undisputed owner of a massive Manhattan real estate empire. I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, breathing in the sterile, highly regulated air of the courthouse. The room was packed with reporters, defrauded investors, and curious legal clerks who wanted to witness the spectacular downfall of the Montgomery family. Isabella was sitting 3 rows ahead of me in the visitor gallery. I barely recognized my own sister. The expensive blonde extensions were completely gone, her hair pulled back in a messy, unwashed knot. She wore a cheap, faded gray sweater that swallowed her thin, shaking frame. She was staring blankly at the floorboards, hugging her knees to her chest. She had zero access to credit, zero access to her trust fund, and she was scheduled to appear in bankruptcy court later this afternoon. Her attempted grand larceny charge for trying to steal the Picasso painting was also looming over her head, ensuring she would never see the inside of a country club or a luxury boutique ever again. She was completely broken. The heavy wooden side doors of the courtroom suddenly swung open. 2 armed federal marshals walked in, leading the prisoners toward the defense tables. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Richard, Catherine, and DeAndre shuffled into the room. They were chained together at the wrists and ankles. The crisp designer suits and glittering diamonds were entirely gone, replaced by bright, humiliating orange prison jumpsuits. In just 14 days, they looked as if they had aged 20 years. DeAndre kept his head bowed in total defeat. He stared at his bright orange canvas shoes, his shoulders slumped. The arrogant tech executive who loved to flash his leased watches and mock my career was completely shattered by the harsh reality of federal lockup. Richard looked completely hollowed out. His skin was pale and sickly. His hands trembled uncontrollably against the heavy steel chains binding his wrists. The self-proclaimed real estate mogul was terrified. Without his stolen money to bully people into submission, he was nothing but a weak, pathetic old man facing the absolute end of his life. Then there was Catherine. My mother looked entirely unrecognizable. Her perfectly dyed blonde hair showed an inch of stark gray roots. Her face was gaunt, stripped of all its expensive cosmetics, revealing every single wrinkle and line of exhaustion. She shuffled forward in her chains, her posture completely defeated. As the marshals guided them to their seats, Catherine slowly turned her head. She scanned the wooden benches of the public gallery. Her eyes swept right past Isabella and landed directly on me. Catherine stopped moving. She stared at me sitting calmly in the back row. A look of profound, desperate panic washed over her aged face. She silently mouthed a single word to me across the crowded courtroom. She mouthed the word, please. She wanted me to save her. She wanted me to call my high-powered lawyers and bail her out of the nightmare she had created. She was begging her scapegoat daughter for mercy. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not show a single ounce of sympathy or sorrow. I maintained a perfectly blank, expressionless face. I gave her one slow, deliberate shake of my head. Absolutely not. Catherine's face crumpled. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks, and she turned back toward the judge's bench, weeping silently into her chained hands. The federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, demanding order in the court. The defense attorneys stepped forward, desperately begging the judge to grant bail. They claimed Richard and Catherine were upstanding members of the community with deep ties to New York. They argued that DeAndre was a cooperative witness who posed no threat to the public. The federal prosecutor immediately shut them down. The prosecutor stood up and laid out the absolute mountain of evidence we had provided to the authorities. The prosecutor read the details of the offshore Cayman Island accounts, the millions in stolen investor capital, the forged trust documents, and the fully documented flight itineraries showing DeAndre planning to flee to Dubai with stolen payroll funds. The judge looked down at the defendants with absolute disgust. He announced that given the massive scale of the financial fraud and the proven undeniable attempts to conceal assets overseas, every single defendant in the room was classified as an extreme flight risk. The judge slammed his gavel down a second time. The loud crack sealed their fate. He officially denied bail for Richard, Catherine, and DeAndre. He remanded all three of them directly to federal custody until their criminal trials commenced. The courtroom erupted into whispers of shock and satisfaction from the defrauded investors in the gallery. The federal marshals immediately grabbed Richard, Catherine, and DeAndre by the arms to escort them back to the holding cells. As Richard was being forcefully turned around by the guards, he looked over his shoulder. He searched the crowd and locked eyes with me one last time. He saw me sitting there in my expensive suit, completely untouched by the destruction of his fraudulent empire. He saw the cold, unyielding power radiating from my posture. He finally understood that I was the one who put him in those chains, and he was never going to breathe free air again. I did not gloat. I did not stand up and shout. I simply raised my hand, looked right into his terrified eyes, and gave Richard a small, polite wave. It was the absolute final nail in his psychological coffin. The drive back to the Hamptons estate was the quietest, most peaceful journey of my life. I left the sterile federal courthouse behind, leaving Richard, Catherine, DeAndre, and Isabella to rot in the miserable beds they had made for themselves. As my driver pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the property, I rolled down the window. The crisp, salty ocean breeze swept through the car, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the suffocating tension I had carried for 20 years. When I walked through the heavy oak front doors, the transformation was breathtaking. I had ordered my contractors to work around the clock the moment the police cleared the scene 2 weeks ago. Everything that represented Richard and Catherine was completely eradicated. The dark, gaudy gold-leafed furniture they had hoarded to feign old money status was ripped out and thrown into the garbage. The oppressive velvet drapes were torn down. In their place, the mansion was flooded with natural sunlight. The walls were painted a brilliant, crisp white, showcasing a stunning collection of bright, vibrant, modern art I had personally curated. The house finally felt like it could breathe. It felt like it belonged to my father again. As I stepped into the grand foyer, the estate staff gathered to greet me. These were the exact same people Richard used to scream at the people he demeaned and degraded on a daily basis to make himself feel powerful. I looked at the head chef, the groundskeepers, the housekeeping staff, and the security personnel. I did not look down on them. I looked them directly in the eye with profound respect. I had personally overhauled every single one of their employment contracts earlier that week. I permanently doubled their salaries to match well above the top market rate. I instituted comprehensive, fully paid health benefits and established a strict zero-tolerance policy for any form of disrespect in my home. The constant suffocating atmosphere of fear that had plagued this estate was completely gone. The staff stood taller now. They offered me genuine warm smiles, not the terrified, forced obedience they used to give Catherine. I thanked them for their hard work in restoring the house and told them to prepare the dining room. I walked down the long, sunlit corridor and stepped into the grand dining room. This was the exact spot where the nightmare had reached its absolute breaking point. The marble floors were buffed to a pristine shine, completely scrubbed of the smashed cake, spilled bourbon, and broken crystal from the night of the raid. A beautiful new dining table made of solid polished walnut anchored the space. Aunt Beatrice was already there waiting for me. She wore a stunning ivory suit looking out the massive bay windows at the rolling ocean waves. She turned to me, her eyes shining with immense pride, and pulled out a chair at the head of the table. I sat down right next to her. We did not need a room full of sycophantic fake high society guests to validate our worth. We had each other, and we had the unbreakable truth. The kitchen doors swung open. The head chef walked out holding a silver serving tray. He approached the head of the table with a bright, proud smile. He did not hand me a hot dog. He did not hand me a flimsy piece of cardboard. He placed two massive, perfectly seared cuts of A5 Wagyu beef directly in front of us. The rich, savory aroma filled the room instantly. But what caught my attention was what the steak was resting on. It was set on real heavy bone-white porcelain. I reached out and touched the edge of the plate, feeling its solid, undeniable weight. I picked up a polished silver fork and a heavy steak knife. I looked at Aunt Beatrice. We raised our crystal glasses filled with sparkling water, clinking them together in a quiet, deeply satisfying toast. I cut a small piece of the Wagyu steak and took a bite. It melted instantly. It did not just taste like a luxury meal. It tasted like absolute unfiltered freedom. It tasted like vindication. I looked around the beautiful sunlit room, completely purged of the toxic shadows that used to haunt my every step. They wanted me to stay in the basement. They wanted me to sleep on a canvas cot next to a leaking water heater and believe that was all I deserved. They wanted me to eat off a paper plate while they feasted on stolen money. But what they did not realize is that when you push someone into the dark for too long, they do not just learn to survive. They learn how to control the shadows. If you are listening to this right now, and you are sitting in a room where people are trying to make you feel small, I need you to understand something. You do not have to accept the narrative they have written for you. You do not have to beg for a seat at a table where you are not respected. You have the power to walk away, to build your own empire, and to carve your own name into stone. Never let a toxic family dictate your worth. You are the author of your own story. Now go out there, take back exactly what is yours, and make sure you write a masterpiece. The most profound lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by those who belittle you. When a toxic family pushes you into the dark, they unwittingly force you to build unbreakable resilience. True power does not come from begging for a seat at a table where you are disrespected. It comes from having the courage to walk away and build your own empire from the ground up. Ultimately, the greatest revenge is finding your own success and absolute peace. Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to find your true strength? Share your experiences in the comments.